Centre for Innovative Justice and Open Circle's Law Week webinar, exploring the recent developments in restorative justice for sexual violence in Victoria. My name's Melanie Joosten. I'm a Senior Advisor at Open Circle, and I'll be chairing the panel today. First of all, I'm going to pass over to Katie, who will be doing an acknowledgement of country.
Thanks, Melanie. So the members of the Open Circle panel are meeting today across the many lands that make up the Kulin Nation. I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the unceded lands of the Jara people on Dja Dja Wurrung country, which is in central Victoria. I acknowledge that our people have practiced and upheld ways of doing justice and addressing harm for thousands of years before invasion. I pay my respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people joining us today. Thank you, Mel.
Thanks, Katie. Today we're talking about restorative justice as a response to the needs of people who have experienced sexual violence. Restorative justice is an increasingly familiar concept that can cover a range of practices and can be used in very different contexts. It's a way of considering the harm caused by a crime, or in this context, an act of sexual violence, and what is then needed to address that harm. Today's panellists are from Open Circle, the restorative justice practice arm of the Centre for Innovative Justice. The Centre for Innovative Justice uses research to develop, drive and expand the capacity of the justice system to meet and adapt to the needs of its diverse users. This includes working to better understand what a person who has experienced sexual violence might be looking for. And if the criminal justice system is unable to meet all their needs, what sort of system or response might play a part in this? While the CIJ is grounded in research, Open Circle is also grounded in practice. As a part of the CIJ, we're a direct provider of restorative processes in a wide range of contexts to support people who have experienced harm. Over the last couple of years, we've increasingly focused on developing our practice to respond to the needs of people who have experienced harm from sexual violence. I just want to acknowledge that this can be quite a heavy topic and it can be close to home for many people. So please take care of yourself today. If you need to step away from this webinar, we will be recording it and it will be available for you to watch at a later point. There will be time at the end for questions. We don't have an open chat function on the webinar today, but you can email any questions to us at open.circle@rmit.edu.au. So that's open.circle@rmit.edu.au. I can put those questions to the panellists towards the end of the hour if we have time. If we don't get to your questions today, or this webinar has given you more questions than answers, please feel free to contact us afterwards on that email or take a look at our website where you can also find our contact details and more information. So I'll introduce the panellists now. We've got Katie Christensen, who's a Wurundjeri woman who was born and raised on Dja Dja Wurrung country in central Victoria. Katie works as a restorative justice conference facilitator with Open Circle. Katie has extensive experience working in the domestic violence sector, supporting women who have experienced violence in crisis, and facilitating healing groups for women. Katie facilitated and contributed to the development of Making Amends, a pilot program for fathers who had used violence in the family home. We've also got Renee Handsaker. Renee is a restorative justice facilitator and the practice lead at Open Circle. Renee has facilitated restorative justice processes involving survivors of sexual assault and the persons directly responsible for the harm, as well as survivors of institutional sexual abuse and the leaders of those institutions responsible for the harm. Renee has a Master's of Narrative Therapy and a background in counselling and social work. And Stan Winford. Stan is Associate Director at the Centre for Innovative Justice at RMIT, where he's particularly interested in exploring how the justice system can have a positive impact on people's lives through restorative and therapeutic approaches to justice, as well as the development of justice systems designed and informed by the experiences of those who use them. Stan is a practicing lawyer who's held a number of senior roles in government and community legal services, both in legal practice and legal policy. As the Senior Legal Advisor to the Attorney General, Stan was involved in major changes to Victorian law, as well as the development of solution-focused courts. Stan's also been Principal Lawyer and Legal Projects Officer at Fitzroy Legal Service, where he led law reform campaigns and public interest litigation. He also worked as the Drug Outreach Lawyer at Fitzroy Legal Service and as a Specialist Criminal Law Advocate So thank you. Welcome to everyone who's come to the webinar today. Welcome to our panelists, and we'll get into it. So Renee, I'm going to ask you first. Can you explain to us what restorative justice is and what it can offer as a response to sexual violence?
Okay, thank you, Melanie. Yeah, just before I start, acknowledge that I'm joining from Wurundjeri country today. Thank you for those introductions, Melanie. So what is restorative justice? I mean, it's a pretty broad framework and definition, but I think most simply, restorative justice is really a framework for responding to crime, wrongdoing, that's really focused on repairing or transforming the harm that it's occurred. So restorative justice is interested in what's the harm that's occurred and what relationships have been impacted by that harm, and what might be an appropriate response to attend to those to attend to the harm and the relationships. So sometimes I think it's actually helpful to contrast, you know, when we're talking about, well, what is restorative justice, because it can look differently all over the world too. It's often a label that is used in many different contexts, but I suppose what we're thinking about, sometimes it's helpful to actually contrast it in relation to the criminal justice system. So if we're thinking about the traditional criminal justice system, it's interested in asking a set of questions, which might be, what law has been broken, who broke that law, and then as a consequence, what punishment do they deserve? So they're the things that the criminal justice system is interested in, whereas a restorative justice framework is really interested in who has been harmed, what are their needs and interests, who has obligations to respond to these needs and interests. And then as the next kind of, the next question would be, well, what's an appropriate process involving all the relevant stakeholders that can respond to these needs, interests and obligations? So I suppose most simply, restorative justice is the creation of a space for a conversation between the people that have been harmed and the people responsible for that harm. Did you ask me another question, Melanie, on top of that? In terms of, you said, yeah, what can restorative justice offer in response to sexual violence? And I think this is a really important question, and one that we've been thinking about for a number of years now at Open Circle. So this won't be news to, I'm sure, anyone that's kind of joining today, but what we do know is that when victim survivors go through the criminal justice system, that it is often can be a very traumatic experience for victim survivors. So one, we know that that there's a low rate of even reporting people's experience of sexual violence or sexual harm. We also know that even if it gets to the report stage, there's a low rate of prosecution. And then we also know that even the ones that get prosecuted, there's a very low rate of conviction. And so it can mean that even if the victim survivor goes through all of those hurdles, and even if they get a conviction, which we know very low percentage, they're often still walking away thinking, and this is what we've heard time and time again from victim survivors who we speak to, I would not wish that on my worst enemy. And so often people have been through the system and say, you know what, I would steer anyone away from that, because even though I got a conviction, that was almost as bad as the actual assault. You know, so actually it can really create secondary trauma for people going through that system. And what I would also say is that system it's designed for a particular purpose, but it's not necessarily designed to meet any of the needs and interests of victim survivors. So there's been a lot of research done. There's particular research by Kathleen Daly around the justice needs and interests of victim survivors. And so what I would say is that the criminal justice system doesn't necessarily, even if you get a conviction, which we know is low, a low chance of, that it's it's not designed to actually meet the needs of the victim survivor.
Thanks, Renee. That makes a lot of sense. So in your experience, what are survivors looking for, and particularly survivors of sexual violence? So they might have an idea in their head that they want justice, but what might that look like for different people?
Thanks, Melanie. Another good question. Firstly, I would, start by acknowledging that victim survivors, not a homogenous kind of group of people, diverse in their needs, interests, hopes, and even their own definitions of what justice means, or what even accountability might mean, and what they're looking for. So the research that has been done that I mentioned before, that's focused on the justice needs and interests, there's a number of things that I suppose help guide our framework. And what we see over and over when we talk to victim survivors, there's really repeated themes, actually. So really importantly, one is the chance for a victim survivor to tell their story, to be heard, to be listened to in their own words, in their own way, to be acknowledged and validated that this event happened, and for the impacts of that not to be minimised. The other thing that is often said that we see as a justice need or interest is the need for information that's often not attended to in a criminal justice process. But often victim survivors might have a question that kind of is on repeat in their mind, that kind of haunts them, why, or what was this, or something that's related to the harm that they would like an answer to. And if they get that answer, it helps kind of make sense or make meaning for them of the event. And it's often not answered in the criminal justice trial. So the need for asking questions, or the need for information. The other thing that's really pertinent to the context of sexual harm is the need for either relationship repair or relationship resetting. So often this harm occurs in the context of families, intimate families, or intimate interpersonal relationships, and it can split families when sexual harm occurs. And so often it can be, even if we're not looking at relationship repair, it might be a conversation around resetting relationships, so that it might be, we might bring people together to have a conversation around, okay, well, what happens at Christmas time now? Who gets invited? Under what circumstances? How will that look? And so there's a really kind of transparent conversation that is about the relationships that have been impacted. The other thing, there's a couple of other things. The other thing I would say is, for victim survivors of sexual violence, accountability is a big one, and accountability in a way that's different to punishment. Some people, punishment is not what they're looking for. They think, and this is particularly if it's in a family relationship too, which is again a barrier to reporting, is like, I don't want my father or my grandfather to go to prison, or my brother, or, but I do want there to be some kind of accountability. I want it to have been acknowledged, and for there to be a response, but I definitely don't want the person that I still, love and have a relationship with to go to prison. So yeah, exploring, well, what would accountability look like? The last thing I'll say about this too, in terms of a really strong justice need and interest for victim survivors, is prevention. So the idea that that they can kind of use their story and their experience to ensure that this doesn't occur to another person. So really kind of strong need to see that the person responsible understands what the impacts have been, to really kind of help ensure that it doesn't get repeated, that behaviour. So really strong prevention need. That's what I was saying. I'll throw it back to you, Melanie.
Thanks, Renee. There was a lot in that, and it was really comprehensive. And I think running through it all is this idea that the victim survivor is very involved in a restorative justice process, and it's a process that they can have some agency in deciding what it is that they need and what they want from the process, and it's not taken out of their hands and imposed upon them, which I think is very important in this context. Katie, I want to go to you. Why might restorative justice be particularly relevant to First Nations victim survivors, acknowledging that individual people will have their own needs, but looking at First Nations communities, what might make restorative justice an important option?
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. So I think, building on what Renee has already said about why restorative processes are good for generally for everyone in a sexual violence context, there are a few extra things that, need to be considered. So since colonisation, we have to keep in mind that Aboriginal women have known rape at the hands of white men without being able to rely on our own cultural justice protocols and ways of doing to protect us, or to, provide some sort of restitution of the harm. So for our women also, those experiences of rape and racism are very inextricably intertwined and can't be kind of separated out. The system that, Renee was talking about that isn't a pleasant one for anyone to go through who has been sexually assaulted is actually the same system that was set up to further and oppress and diminish Aboriginal people. That it was a system that was actually set up to continue that genocidal work of the colonial project. So it's really not a place for Aboriginal people. And today we know that Aboriginal women are 3 to 8 times more likely to experience sexual assault than non-Aboriginal women. And we know that that number is most likely higher, but it's due to low reporting. We don't have exact figures. And so when we think about, well, what are the barriers? Why aren't Aboriginal people reporting sexual assault? Culturally, sexual abuse is a taboo to talk about. And we know for non-Indigenous victims of sexual abuse, victim survivors, it's already so hard for people to talk about what's happened to them. And so then when we add that extra layer of cultural protocol and taboo over Aboriginal people, they're even more reluctant to tell. And then when we're looking at who they're telling, who they're reporting to, we have, of course, that deep mistrust that exists between Aboriginal people and non-Aboriginal authority representatives. So, police, doctors, government, all of that history of betrayal, when anyone has come forward, things have often been used against us. So there's a real deep mistrust there that people aren't going to be with authority figures, so they're not going to want to be reporting. And then if we do report, there's a real lack of cultural safety around how that is received and how it is handled. So there's lots of different complexity layers as to what and barriers as to why Aboriginal people aren't reporting in the first place. And then if we look again, adding another layer, if the person responsible for the harm is also Aboriginal, then, that creates a whole lot of extra problems, because for an Aboriginal person to report against someone in the community, you are seen as striking out against your community. The fact of the matter is that Aboriginal people die in custody. So if you're responsible for sending someone in your community off to die, or to be further traumatized by the state, then you will be blamed for that. And then, of course, there's that fear of feeding into stereotypes. So we're very well aware of the pervasive discriminatory ideas that there are around us being lazy, drug abusing rapists, basically. That's very much out there. You only have to watch like Sky News or something to see how big it is. And if we're going along and reporting, then we're feeding into those stereotypes. And so that's obviously another thing that we're really keen to not do. So why restorative for Aboriginal people? There's a need for self-determined responses for our communities and our people, and restorative justice can really fit that requirement. it's a great option because it takes the problem or the incident, the harm, out of the reach of the justice system, and that's a system that is very harmful for us. It doesn't necessarily, restorative justice process doesn't necessarily require talking specifically about the incident, which, as I've mentioned, can be really taboo. So the focus can be on the impacts of the harm, and the process can be based around that. So there's not a need to re-traumatize or talk about things that aren't culturally safe or appropriate. It's sort of victim survivor led, so the person can be supported by members of the community, and so can the person responsible. So it's not a process where we're looking to do further harm to anybody. So you can have members of your community through the process supporting you, and you can also have outside supports as well, but really important to have those members of community there. And basically, as Aboriginal people, we have intimate knowledge of the protocols that we need. We have intimate knowledge of the support that's out there, where to get it, and what our justice needs and interests are. So again, we're in the driver's seat, so it's going to be a much better option for us. And I think, at the end of the day, for our people, there's no justice in a courtroom, but there can be culturally appropriate accountability, validation, voice and healing in a restorative process for us. So I see it as a really good option.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, there was a lot of really sobering context in there, showing the complexities of that situation and how restorative justice can really speak to First Nations communities and be quite a useful tool. So thank you. Stan, I'm going to ask you now. Both Renee and Katie have sort of talked a lot about the criminal justice system. And in recent years, there's been a growing understanding of the need to better support victim survivors of sexual violence in their approach to the criminal justice system, and also outside and beyond of that. Restorative justice is one way of doing this. What are some of the more recent developments in this space, supporting victims and around restorative justice?
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, there have been some important recent developments, but I guess they've come on the back of some longer term trends in our system. And as we've heard, not only has there been a growing recognition that there's a need for choice for victim survivors, and that choice might require access to alternative and complementary responses. And of course, that also relates to a growing recognition of the diversity of victim survivors themselves. So with that recognition, there's been several reviews of the role of victims which have talked about what sort of choices victims might need in seeking justice, and many of those reviews have supported restorative justice as an option. And alongside that, there's been some growing acceptance and use of restorative justice in other contexts. So things like redress schemes involving responses to institutional abuse. In Victoria, we've got restorative responses available in relation to experience of sexual harassment and other forms of sexual harm within the Victoria Police Force. That's been a recommendation in relation to our ambulance service. Human Rights Commission federally has also recommended workplace sexual harassment have a restorative response available to complainants, and similarly our Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission has made those sorts of recommendations. In 2008, there was a Family Violence Royal Commission which recommended a restorative response be established, and that's been established. And we're also seeing restorative justice mentioned in state and national plans to end violence against women and children, although in a reasonably limited way. I think also the other context is that there have been positive evaluations of programs internationally and in other jurisdictions. Probably the leading jurisdiction for restorative justice in response to sexual violence is the Australian Capital Territory, which expanded their restorative justice response, which was legislated in 2018. But we've also heard that in Queensland, there's an expansion of the adult restorative justice response for sexual violence foreshadowed as well. But I think probably the most recent significant development is government recognition of the need for something to be available in this space, and the government's moved closer to doing something about that by asking the Victorian Law Reform Commission to undertake a review, and the Law Reform Commission was given a reference in relation to broadly the response of the justice system to sexual offences in November 2021. The report was released in November 2021, and it has many recommendations. Some of those have been acted on by the government. Restorative justice has been recommended. There's a whole chapter in that report devoted to restorative justice by the Law Reform Commission, and clearly the Law Reform Commission endorses restorative justice, and they say the time has come for restorative justice in Victoria. They say in their report that restorative justice should be an additional justice option for victim survivors alongside the criminal justice system, and they recommend that the government establish a scheme for restorative justice responses to sexual violence so that RJ is done safely and well. We've got a bit of time, so I might just quickly run through some of what their recommendations covered at a high level. So I think this is important. The Law Reform Commission has identified that principles are very important in restorative justice, and the principles that they've set out are that it needs to be voluntary, that it needs to address accountability, that it needs to prioritise the needs of the person harmed, that confidentiality and transparency are part of the principles that should apply to any response. And they also talk about the need for governance of responses and for those responses to be integrated within the justice system as a whole. They also say that adequate resourcing is essential, and some of the things they say that's needed for are for independent professional support throughout the process, for independent legal advice, and this is something that we can talk about a bit more later, but in particular, when people experience sexual violence, they may have other legal processes through the criminal trial process or through civil litigation or whatever, and in order to understand their rights and the implications of participating in a restorative process, it's important that they have access to independent advice. And in the Law Reform Commission's report, they also talk about the need to fund assessments, and they can take different forms, I suppose, and in the way that our service operates, we have a way of assessing people's suitability, and we rely on specialist assessments ourselves to ensure that the process can be done within that safety structure that Renee has spoken about. Going to Katie's discussion points, they also recognise that Aboriginal communities should be supported to design restorative programs for Aboriginal people. And interestingly, they also talk about when restorative justice should be available. I think we share their view about the role of restorative responses as being supplementary or complementary to criminal justice processes, going back to that important notion of providing choice to people, but also, as many people recognise, there is always an ongoing risk, given what's happened historically, of reprivatising or, I guess, sort of suppressing access to a formal system if that's what people are looking for. So that notion of a supplementary process is sort of clearly recommended by the Law Reform Commission. And then they go on to talk about how and when restorative processes should be available, and really run through, I guess, the continuum of the criminal justice process. So it's a very good report, and it provides a very strong, comprehensive basis for government response. But I think so far we haven't heard a lot publicly from government about their plans in this space. We've seen the government legislate in relation to affirmative consent and undertake some other reforms, but the government media release on the 12th of November, when the Law Reform Commission report was released, doesn't commit to or explicitly mention restorative justice. So yeah, it's still it's clear there aren't there's no shortage of recommendations, inquiries, reviews and evidence that are very strongly supportive of this, and certainly in the work that our service and our centre's been doing, we're hearing from people in the sector that it's sort of needed, and in some ways even possibly seeing a bit of a shift in some quarters about the appropriateness of this form of response. But the fact remains that if you happen to be in Victoria and experience sexual violence, you won't have a well-resourced, comprehensive scheme. So we think there's a lot more that needs to be done to make this form of justice accessible to victim survivors. And one of the things that, again, we can talk about a bit later is the need for legislation at the very least to send a clear message that this is a legitimate option in our system, and also to reduce some of the risks or barriers that people might perceive to participating in the absence of a kind of legal protection about the use of evidence that could be given during a restorative process. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. I think you've given us a really good overview and really highlighted the fact that there is a growing understanding of restorative justice as a good response and as one that is in use and in practice. So I'm going to ask you, Renee, to talk a little bit more specifically about how Open Circle is currently practicing in this space. And we've developed a practice model that's specifically about responding to people who've experienced sexual violence. So I was wondering, can you talk about some of the features of the Open Circle model and how this works in practice, so we can kind of get down into a little bit more the nuts and bolts of it?
Sure, thanks, Melanie. Yeah, and I did just want to pick up on a point that Stan made, that we are interested in expanding kind of choice and options for victim survivors, not necessarily closing them down. So having restorative justice as an additional option is that if a victim survivor wants to access the criminal justice system, absolutely in full support of that, but this could be an additional, an extra, or an instead of option for people. Yeah, so just going back to your question, Melanie, around the model, you are right that we, over the last few years have been developing and thinking through what does a framework or a model to respond to sexual violence require to ensure it's robust, it's safe, it's thoughtful, and really importantly, it's aware and alive to the dynamics of gendered violence. So, of course, as a service, we have restorative justice principles that guide any process that we are working through. So some of those kind of more generic principles, I suppose, are to do no further harm, that the process is voluntary. So it's based on informed consent. So and that includes every single person that they would need to consent and be really clear about what they're stepping into. That whatever facilitated dialogue takes place, that it's respectful and productive in nature. And really importantly too, that any response is flexible. So we don't have a prescribed, predetermined expectation of what a response has to look like, that we can design that around the needs and interests of the participants. So that means, and really importantly, again, context of sexual violence, it doesn't necessarily have to mean a face-to-face meeting. That can be what we're working towards, but if someone would feel more comfortable with a letter exchange or a video conversation, we would absolutely be working towards that instead, if that was people's preference. So I suppose so this is sort of like the foundational model, and then we sort of add some extra things to overlay if we're responding to sexual violence. And so early on, we contracted a number of people to sort of join our team and work with us, and they're what we refer to as accountability specialists. So they have They're a long history in working in the space of men's accountability, in sort of men's behaviour change programs, so working with invitations to accountability. So what we use accountability specialists for in our program is that we can use them as secondary consults. So if we get a referral, we might ring the person up and say, okay, this is the context, this is what we're kind of looking for. Where do you see the red flags? Where are the safety concerns? What can we reasonably predict? We'll have conversations in a secondary consult way. We'll also, where it's appropriate, invite them into the process to actually travel through a restorative justice process with us and be having one-on-one and group conversations with us as facilitators with the person responsible. So yeah, and that's really to kind of help us as a program and facilitators stay alive to the dynamics of gendered violence. So be alert to when people responsible are using justifications or minimisations, or kind of engaging in grooming behaviour, things that we know are well-known dynamics. Yeah, so that, I suppose that's a way for our program to be accountable to those dynamics. Perhaps I can bring it to life a little bit, because it is sort of hard to know what what we're talking about, and maybe I can just draw on an example of a facilitated dialogue that we facilitated maybe a month ago now. And this referral came to us between two family members. The sexual violence had occurred over 30 years ago, and these two family members hadn't seen each other since. The victim survivor considered going to the police and was wondering about sort of engaging in that criminal justice process, but then on reflection thought, actually, I think that my goals for why I'm doing this could be better suited to restorative justice. So she explored that with us. We set about doing really extensive preparation, which actually probably we were working on this preparation for close to a year, and that's not a full year of sort of ongoing conversations. There were little breaks along the way, but just to kind of show that we would never bring anyone together without some very careful and thoughtful preparation. I could have a whole nother seminar on what the preparation looks like and what we would do in that space, but we probably don't have time today. But just for people to know that the preparation is extensive in terms of ensuring that people are suitable, ready and safe to proceed. So perhaps I actually have some words from this victim survivor here that I want to share, because I think it's always best when we can to actually use people's words. So a question that we asked really early on is, why did you want to participate in a restorative justice process? And she says, as soon as you report it to the police, you're just a witness in their process. I felt like, hang on, this is my story. But after you report it, there's no control over the story. I was afraid of going through a court case, as it was made very clear that the process could be combative and stressful. I wanted the process to be about my needs, rather than just becoming a witness in someone else's story. This was my story, and I wanted to have my needs met. So that's part of sort of her motivation and goal. So in conversations with her, we established pretty early on that one of the main goals for her was that this other family member who had perpetrated sexual harm really understood the impacts of what she'd experienced and the lifelong impacts, for 30 years, what she'd been living with, grappling with, and the ways that she'd been surviving. So given that was the goal, that the person responsible really understood the impact of his actions, we did invite in an accountability specialist, and we worked together with the accountability specialist and us as facilitators with the person responsible for, again, a reasonably big chunk of time. We had many conversations to ensure that that person was really ready and in a position to be able to hear, to really deeply listen, to acknowledge and understand the impacts without bringing forth any of those things that can really minimise a victim survivor's experience or story. So we worked really hard on doing that before we established that, yes, these people were ready to come together for a face-to-face conversation. So part of the preparation, we're also working with the victim survivor on what story does she want to tell? How does she want to tell it? How will she walk away and know that she's said what she wants to say, and that she can look back and be proud of that? How can she do that in a way that honours kind of her values and goals? So we do a lot of preparation. So we brought these two together, and the victim survivor was able to share what she wanted to share very bravely and very powerfully. Speak about her story in the impacts. And the person responsible was able to really sit there for an extended amount of time and really listen, deeply listen, and acknowledge, again, without those minimisations, the justifications, and really honour and acknowledge what the impacts had been. Very moving and powerful conversation, I would say. An extension of that there were also a couple of actions of further accountability that were important to the victim survivor that she requested as part of this conversation and that he agreed to. Yeah, I won't go into what those are, because, but yeah, essentially that was part of the conversation as well. I perhaps just in kind of finishing up this, I will go back to, again, her words, because we asked for some of her reflections following this conversation and bringing the restorative justice process to a close. We asked her, if anything, what has changed for you as a result of actually embarking on this restorative justice process? She says, I think the process itself has been very helpful on my healing journey. It's helped me feel more confident in myself and given me the personal power to make personal decisions and stick to them. It's helped me get to a place where I can feel proud of myself for coming this far and recognising I have further to go in healing without being afraid of the pain that comes along on the way. So I think that was a really powerful reflection from her, that she did what she had wanted to do, and she felt really proud on the other side of the way that she'd been able to do it, and even the fact that she'd been able to do that. Really importantly, some of the reflections from the person responsible were, he reflected it was a harder process than he had ever imagined it was going to be, but on the other side of it, he actually felt a sense of relief that this was now out in the open, and that he could now begin to take steps towards repair because it was now out in the open. So yeah, that's a small little reflection on one that we brought together around a month ago now.
Thanks, Renee. That's really given an idea, I think, of what it looks like in practice and the effect that it can have for both people involved, and an effect, I think, that's, quite markedly different from what many people would say their experience of the criminal justice system might be. So I want to talk a little bit about what might help victim survivors to get access to restorative justice, taking into account, Stan's earlier comments that there's a lot of support, but the actual provision of it is, much more minimal. So Katie, can you talk about the referral pathway that we've established with CASA CV and how it allows people to explore the possibilities of restorative justice, and maybe like some examples of some of the contexts it might be used in?
Yeah, sure. So with our partnership with CASA, we knew we wanted to complement the community-based responses that were already in place for victim survivors of sexual harm, and they're doing great work, so why reinvent the wheel? We wanted to do something that would really complement that. So we wanted to develop, it was a no-brainer really to be wanting to develop a strong partnership with the CASAs, because who is better to support a victim survivor through the restorative process than an experienced counsellor advocate. Whenever we're doing a restorative justice process, whether it be in the context of sexual violence or outside of it, we always really encourage and prefer it if people have some sort of support, like whether it be counselling or whatever outside of the process, because it can be the process itself, it's hopefully therapeutic, but also like there's a lot of support that's required through it. And so in the context of sexual harm, CASA is really the place to provide that. So currently I'm sitting at the Bendigo CASA office one afternoon a week, and this allows me to be available to the CASA staff and to develop that relationship. So they come in and they might run scenarios by me. This helps them to develop a further understanding of what restorative justice looks like and which scenarios it's going to fit best to. And it is one of those things where it's very difficult. There's no real hard and fast rules. So there are some hard and fast rules, but we're always keen to explore it as an option for people. So it's really great to have that time with the counsellor advocates and work through that. So the staff often just come in and take a seat in the office and they'll say, oh, I've got this person and, this is the scenario and what do you think? So I'm there to kind of run through just the idea of a restorative process for different people and in different scenarios. I'm also there to support them in ways of how to introduce it. So they might be having a session with someone and they go, oh, I've got this session with this person. This is what's going on. I think RJ might be good. What do you think? How should I introduce it as an idea? So I'm there to support them to do that. I'm also available if they sometimes they bring it up with someone and the person often has a lot of questions. And so then I might come in on an appointment and, just help talk through any of those questions and concerns. And that's before there's any paperwork exchanged or anything. It's really there to just say, hey, this is an option. What do you think? And also once that intake form has been given to us, the person doesn't necessarily have to go through with the restorative process. It is voluntary all the way along. But also if they say, oh, I'm not sure, the timing might be off, then we have their details. They don't need to go back through CASA to if they do decide to continue with the restorative justice process, they can contact us directly. So there's no pressure, but there's a lot of information sharing and just, making sure people feel comfortable and that they are really aware of what's involved in a restorative justice process. So the focus is really working on building that relationship with the counsellor advocates so that they feel really confident that we're not going to do any further harm to the people they're supporting. But also for the victim survivors to have a really clear understanding of what a restorative process might entail, and they know that they build that relationship with us alongside their relationship with their CASA support, and I think that makes it a much nicer starting point and a much nicer foundation for victim survivors. So since being located, I think I started the end of February, the start of March, I started doing my one afternoon a week at CASA. So it's not been a huge amount of time, but there's actually been, I didn't expect there to be as many referrals so quickly. I thought it would take a while for the CASA staff to really warm up, but they're straight onto it. So there's been a real broad spectrum of referrals, really. There's been quite a few that have been historical sexual abuse. So, when people are young and it's a sibling or a cousin, and they're older now and they, again, oftentimes don't want to go through a criminal justice proceedings, or they're unable to given the age of the people when the abuse occurred. There's been some in recent sexual assaults in the context of dating or dating apps. And how to navigate especially in a regional town where people sort of run into each other, how to navigate living and an opportunity to speak to the impacts of the harm. There's been some in the context of institutional abuse, so churches, and also there was one in the context of some harmful sexual behaviours that were being acted out in a school context, and the school were looking for support. So yeah, a really broad range, which again is why we need to kind of be able to talk through each scenario as it comes up, rather than kind of going yes, this or and not that. Yeah, so it's been really, really great. I think we're off to a really good start with the relationship, and I look forward to it continuing.
Thanks, Katie. It was good to hear about that. We're going to wrap up soon, and we will have a little bit of time for audience questions. So if you do have a question, email it through to open.circle@rmit.edu.au. And before we go to those, I'll just go one more question to the panelists. What would you like to see in the future to make restorative justice an option that's more accessible and a proper choice available to people who've experienced harm from sexual violence? And what might we do? What might we need to do to make this happen? So Stan, I'll ask you first, and if the others have anything they'd like to chip in before we go to audience questions, that would be great.
Thanks, Melanie. So I think there are a few things, but probably the first one that I'd be suggesting we need is some form of legislation, and that's for three main reasons. First, we need to send a signal that this is an option for people, and in our experience, when things are kind of alternatives or a bit kind of like not widely known, they quickly drop off the radar for people, and it's also difficult to have discussions within formal parts of the system about how this response might be available to someone if it's not there written in a piece of legislation. So I think legislation really sends a signal. It helps make clear that this is an option. It really publicises the availability of this for people in the community in one form or another, and will help in options talks, in legal advice, when CARSs or other victims services are talking to people that come to them looking for a response. The other thing that I touched on earlier was that we need legislation to protect what's said and done in a restorative process, because some people will be concerned about that, and it might create a barrier for them. And there are other areas that legislation might be able to clarify, including really setting out how it interacts with other legal processes. For example, if it happens before someone's sentenced, what effect will it have on sentencing, and so on. So I think that's really important, and I think that's the minimum. I think we could, we are doing it, but we could really do it with that on a bigger scale. But obviously, to provide any service funding is important, and as I mentioned earlier, and as we've heard from Renee and Katie, the process is a very careful one, and it involves a lot of work with people over a period of time. So really resources need to support that careful approach, and where necessary, other independent advisors to support the approach. And look, there has been, some people are worried about the cost of this sort of approach, but I think the fact that it's available in the ACT, in New Zealand, the UK, in Canada, that tells me that it is doable and it is affordable for governments to do it, and certainly for community-based providers to deliver those services is really a drop in the ocean compared to the amount of money that we spend on other parts of our justice system. I think referral pathways that, as Katie's outlined, they're really critical. Victim survivors need to be made aware of options, and the people that they interact with need to know about them as well. So those strong referral pathways are important, so that we can really make this idea of choice meaningful. In other jurisdictions, there are really clear codes of practice for victims of crime where they have a right to be informed about this option, how to access it. In Belgium and parts of Europe, prosecutors are required to notify people about this option. Obviously, you've got to have the option available before you start telling people about it, but that's a really important part of it. So yeah, those are critical. And look, just going back to the broader issue, I think that this is something that you know, where people are reporting sexual violence, attrition rates are high, prosecution rates are low, conviction rates are very low, but we know also that the formal processes can be traumatic, and it shouldn't be out of the question that people can choose a different pathway or a complementary pathway. And I think it's really important that people who think this should be an option are really communicating that to government and to others who have the power to do something about it, so that this becomes a real choice for people in our jurisdiction. Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. We've got just a couple of minutes left. One of the questions that's come through is someone saying they're curious, wondering if the CASA Open Circle partnership is happening just in Bendigo at this stage. Katie, would you like to respond?
Yeah, so we do receive referrals from CASAs throughout Victoria. So it's not like we don't have relationships sort of on the go, but Bendigo is the only place where one of us is actually situated for one afternoon a week. But yeah, be always looking to grow that.
Thanks, Katie. Another question we've got time to just squeeze one in, I think, is someone is wondering, is there a difference in how you deal with safety and risk when working with a victim survivor of sexual violence within a family violence relationship? How do you manage the very particular dynamics of power and control, ensuring that safety is the highest priority and that there's a lesser likelihood of escalation or risk faced by the victim survivor by participating in the process? Renee might take that one.
Sure. It's a good question. And because there is a restorative justice service set up within the Department of Justice that is focused on taking family violence referrals, we wouldn't actually accept a referral where there was a current family violence risk and dynamic around safety. So yeah, so we would, anything where there's a sort of dynamic of family violence that may still be active, we would refer that to the Family Violence Restorative Justice team at the Department of Justice. So that's a very kind of quick answer, but in terms of just attending to those kind of dynamics that you talk about in terms of power and control, of course, they're still there in sort of in the dynamics of sexual violence. So yeah, but that's obviously what we would draw on our accountability specialists, yeah, to assist with that.
Thanks, Renee. And that brings us to 12 o'clock, and so we'll be closing the webinar. But thank you for people who have sent in questions, and we'll make sure that we respond to you directly via email for those. Thank you to our panellists. It was really wonderful to hear your experience and to speak about these developments. And thank you to the audience for everyone who's come along as part of Law Week. It's really important, I think, to spread the word about these alternative forms that are available in Victoria. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.